Snoop Dogg had been through airport security more times than he could count. Private jets, first-class lounges, TSA checkpoints, he had seen it all. He knew the drill. Shoes off. Belt off. Laptop in a separate bin. Hands up for the body scan. But today, the energy was different. It wasn't just a routine check. It was something else. The officer watching him wasn't just doing his job, he was looking for something. Snoop could see it in his stance, in the way his eyes lingered too long, in the way his fingers hovered near his radio, like he was just waiting for an excuse to escalate things. Then, the words came. "Sir, we need to conduct an additional screening." Snoop exhaled slowly, already knowing exactly where this was going. And what happened next? It turned the entire airport into a scene no one would forget. Snoop Dogg had flown more times than he could count. He had been through every kind of airport security, private terminals, VIP lounges, commercial flights, small-town runways, and international customs. He knew the process like the back of his hand. And most of the time, it was smooth. But today, it was different. From the moment he stepped into the security line, he felt it, that shift in energy, that unspoken tension. Most TSA agents kept it moving, waving passengers through, barely glancing at their screens. But one of them had his eyes locked onto Snoop from the second he entered the checkpoint. The man wasn't just checking IDs. He was looking for something. And Snoop could feel it in his bones. He was the target. Snoop Dogg had been through airport security more times than he could count. He had walked through metal detectors in cities all over the world, from luxury private airports to packed international terminals. He knew the process, knew the routine, knew the rhythm of moving through checkpoints like it was second nature. But from the moment he stepped into the security line today, he knew something wasn't right. It wasn't the usual hum of travelers shuffling through bins, tossing their shoes onto conveyor belts, fumbling for passports, and checking their pockets for loose change. It was the way one TSA agent had locked onto him. Not in a passing glance. Not in the way an officer casually monitors a line. But in a deliberate, unblinking, focused way, like he was just waiting for the moment to pounce. And Snoop had seen this game before. It wasn't what the agent said. It was how he stood. Feet planted too firmly, squared shoulders, hands resting just a little too close to his radio, as if he was already preparing for something. Snoop had dealt with people like him before. People who weren't enforcing rules, people who weren't just doing their jobs, but people who wanted to flex their authority, who wanted to prove a point, who wanted to let you know that they had the power in this moment, not you. And today, that agent had chosen the wrong man. Snoop knew how the game was played. He had watched it unfold too many times. A man gets singled out. A question gets asked. A search gets extended. And before he even realizes it, he's not just another traveler anymore, he's a suspect. It didn't matter that Snoop had cleared security 1,000 times before. Didn't matter that he was one of the most recognizable faces in music. Didn't matter that his record was clean. Because in that moment, in that airport, in that checkpoint, he wasn't Snoop Dogg. He was just another black man being pulled aside for a random check. "Sir, step to the side," the TSA agent finally said, his voice flat, routine, but a little too eager, a little too rehearsed. Snoop exhaled slowly. "What's the issue?" he asked, keeping his tone even. "Random screening," the agent replied, nodding toward a separate area near the scanners. Random. Snoop almost laughed. Because he knew better than anyone, there was nothing random about this. Snoop moved like he always did, cool, collected, unbothered. He wasn't about to give them what they wanted. No frustration. No anger. No resistance. Because he had learned a long time ago that men like this weren't just looking for security threats. They were looking for reactions. Looking for reasons. Looking for excuses. And Snoop wasn't about to give them one. His bags were already on the belt, his pockets were already empty, his shoes were already off. And yet, the agent ran his hands over the same areas twice. Then 3 times. Then 4. His fingers lingered at Snoop's pockets. Patted down his hoodie, then did it again. Checked the cuffs of his jeans. Then checked them again. And Snoop just stood there, watching, waiting, letting the moment stretch long enough for everyone around them to start noticing. The agent cleared his throat, straightened his stance, then finally asked, "Where are you flying today?" Snoop tilted his head slightly. That wasn't a security question. "Why does that matter?" he asked, keeping his voice low, his expression unreadable. The agent shifted, not expecting pushback. "Just standard procedure," he muttered. "Are you traveling alone?" Snoop let a small smirk pull at the corner of his mouth. Because now, the script was playing out exactly like he thought it would. It wasn't about security. It wasn't about safety. It wasn't about anything that had to do with actual airport protocol. Because at the end of the day, this wasn't a security check. This was a power play. And Snoop had no intention of letting it slide. "You carrying any cash over $10,000? The agent asked, his voice dropping slightly, his fingers hovering near Snoop's bag. And that was when Snoop finally had enough. He stepped back slightly, raised his hands, not in surrender, but in a way that made sure everyone in the surrounding area could see. "Yo, hold up," he said, his voice carrying just enough to turn heads. "What exactly are you looking for?" The agent hesitated. And suddenly, he wasn't so sure anymore. The energy had shifted. Passengers had slowed down. Some pretended not to look, peeking over their phones. Others weren't even hiding it anymore, openly watching as the moment unfolded. And Snoop just stood there, cool as ever, letting the tension settle, letting the weight of the moment grow. Because this wasn't about just him anymore. This was about every person who had ever been pulled aside for no reason. Every traveler who had been treated differently because of how they looked. Every moment when power had been used not for security, but for intimidation. And today, Snoop wasn't playing along. Snoop Dogg had been through countless airport security checks, seeing TSA officers wave people through without so much as a second glance, and watched travelers breeze past the scanners like ghosts. But today, none of that applied to him. Today, he wasn't just another passenger moving through the line. He was the target. He had felt it from the second he walked into the checkpoint. He had seen it in the way the agent's eyes tracked him, in the way his hands flexed at his sides like he was ready for something more than just a routine screening. This wasn't about security. It was about control. And now, as he stood in a separate screening area, watching the TSA officers circle him like a predator sizing up prey, he knew this wasn't going to be quick. Snoop had been patient. Had followed every rule. Shoes off. Belt off. Laptop in a separate bin. Body scan? Clear. No beeps. No alarms. No reason for any of this to continue. And yet, the agent's hands pressed against the same spots again. Then again. Then again. Each time firmer, longer, more deliberate, as if searching for something that wasn't there, as if hoping to create a reason to escalate the situation further. Snoop's hands stayed at his sides, fingers relaxed, his breathing even. He wasn't about to flinch, wasn't about to twitch, wasn't about to give them a single moment to claim he had resisted anything. He had played this game before. And he wasn't about to let them win. "You traveling alone?" the agent asked, his voice low, casual, too casual. Snoop didn't answer right away. Not because he didn't know what to say, but because he was letting the moment stretch, letting the silence do the talking first, letting the weight of the situation settle in. Finally, he raised an eyebrow. "That got something to do with TSA now?" The agent didn't like that. His jaw clenched, his fingers flexing, but he forced a smile, The kind of smile a man wears when he realizes he's losing control but doesn't want to admit it yet. "Just standard questions," he muttered. "Standard. Right." Snoop watched as the agent moved toward his bag, placing it on the table like it was a piece of evidence instead of a carry-on. "Sir, I'm going to need to inspect your belongings." Snoop exhaled through his nose, slow and steady. He had no problem with them checking his bag, if they had an actual reason to. But this wasn't about policy. This was about perception. And now, they were making it clear that they weren't just looking for something illegal. They were looking for something to justify the stop itself. The TSA agent unzipped Snoop's bag, his fingers moving through his neatly folded clothes with a slowness that felt intentional, deliberate, drawn out as if trying to make a statement. One shirt. Another. A pair of sneakers. A book. A small velvet pouch, one that held nothing but sunglasses. And then, finally, the agent found what he was looking for. Not drugs. Not weapons. Not anything illegal. Cash. Snoop watched as the agent pulled out a stack of neatly folded bills, flipping through them like he had just uncovered the biggest find of his career. "You carrying over $10,000 today?" Snoop almost laughed. Almost. Because now, it was clear what this had been about from the start. It wasn't security. It wasn't protocol. It was power. The agent was trying to turn this into something bigger, trying to create suspicion where there was none, trying to turn a man with a clean record into a concern because that was the only way he could justify wasting Snoop's time. Snoop tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. "You counting my money now?" The agent's grip on the bills tightened just slightly, like he was waiting for Snoop to react, waiting for him to push back, waiting for any reason to escalate this further. But Snoop didn't give him one. Instead, he exhaled, slow and patient, and turned his gaze toward the growing number of passengers watching from beyond the security line. Because now, it wasn't just TSA watching him. The whole airport was. A second TSA officer appeared, then a third, and then, finally, a supervisor. An older man, more seasoned, more aware of what was happening. And the second his eyes landed on Snoop, he knew that his officer had pushed too hard. Knew that this was about to turn into something much bigger. Knew that they had picked the wrong man to mess with today. The supervisor cleared his throat. "Everything all right here?" Snoop didn't answer. Because he wasn't the one who needed to explain himself. The TSA agent took a step back, nodding toward the bag, toward the money, scrambling for words now that there was a witness who outranked him. "Just a routine check," he muttered. "Routine." Snoop finally let out a chuckle, shaking his head. "Routine," he repeated, his voice just loud enough for the crowd to hear. The supervisor let out a slow breath, glancing at the agent, then back at Snoop. He was trying to fix this before it got worse. "You're free to go, Mr. Broadus." The agent's face tightened, his jaw clenching. Because he knew what that meant. It meant he had been wrong. And now he had to let Snoop walk. Snoop didn't snatch his bag. Didn't storm out. Didn't let them turn him into another headline about aggression or unruly passengers. Instead, he took his time. Zipped up his bag. Slid his wallet back into his pocket. And as he slung his backpack over his shoulder, he turned to the agent one last time. Didn't say a word. Didn't need to. Because in that moment, the message had already been sent. And as he walked away, TSA watched him go, the other passengers still staring, the energy in the room still crackling from a moment that wouldn't be forgotten. Because today, Snoop Dogg reminded everyone that real power isn't in a badge, or a uniform, or a title. It's in knowing when to stand your ground, without ever having to raise your voice. At first, it had just been another routine checkpoint. Another set of passengers moving through security, another wave of people rushing to catch their flights, another morning where no one paid attention to what was happening around them. But now everything had changed. Because when someone like Snoop Dogg gets stopped, people notice. And in this moment, the airport was no longer just a place of movement, it had become a stage. A stage where a power struggle was playing out in real time. A stage where one TSA agent had stepped too far into the role of authority. And a stage where Snoop Dogg, standing calmly, silently, was reminding everyone that power isn't just about who wears the badge, it's about who truly controls the moment. The agent's grip on Snoop's wallet tightened for just a second too long, as if he still believed he had the upper hand, as if he still believed he could find something, anything, to justify what had already gone too far. His fingers hovered over the stack of cash inside, flipping through the bills like he was looking for something hidden, like money itself was now suspicious just because Snoop had it. "You traveling with over $10,000 in cash?" the agent asked again, but this time, his voice carried something different, not authority, but desperation. Snoop exhaled through his nose, slow, steady, controlled. And then, finally, he smiled. Because he knew what the agent had just realized. This wasn't a search. This was a mistake. And now, too many people were watching for him to take it back. Snoop wasn't the only one who felt it. The other TSA officers, the passengers in line, the security cameras mounted in the corners of the terminal, they all saw it too. The shift. The realization. The moment the TSA agent started to understand that he had miscalculated. That he had let whatever personal bias or need for control push him into a situation that wasn't going to end in his favor. Because this wasn't just about Snoop Dogg anymore. This was about everyone who had ever been singled out for no reason. And the people in line? They weren't just watching. They were waiting. The arrival of the TSA supervisor didn't happen loudly, didn't come with flashing lights or a show of force. It happened quietly, cautiously, the way someone steps into a situation they're already regretting being involved in. He was older, more seasoned, someone who had seen his fair share of airport incidents before. But even he knew, the second he stepped into this mess, that it had already gone too far. Because this wasn't some random traveler who would take his bags and leave in frustration. This was one of the most recognizable figures in the world, standing in the middle of an airport, being watched by dozens of people and security cameras, and, by now, probably being filmed. And if there was one thing TSA didn't want, it was a PR nightmare involving Snoop Dogg. The TSA agent straightened his back as soon as the supervisor appeared, as if trying to regain control, as if hoping the presence of his superior would somehow make his case stronger. "Routine screening," he said quickly, his voice clipped, mechanical. "Standard protocol." Snoop raised an eyebrow. He didn't need to say anything. Because everyone in that airport knew that wasn't true. They had watched other passengers walk through security without a second glance. They had seen people clear the checkpoint in seconds. They had heard the agent's questions, seen his hands linger in places they shouldn't have. And now, TSA had to come up with a reason to explain why they had done all this for nothing. Snoop exhaled slowly, took his wallet back from the agent's hands, and let the moment stretch just long enough for the weight of it to settle. Then, finally, he spoke. "Routine, huh?" The words weren't loud, weren't aggressive, weren't anything more than a statement, but they landed heavier than anything else that had been said that day. Because it wasn't just a question. It was a challenge. And the TSA agent? He didn't have an answer. The TSA supervisor, clearly sensing the tension in the air, cleared his throat, stepping forward, trying to smooth things over before it spiraled even further. "You're free to go, Mr. Broadus," he said, nodding toward the security lane. "Have a safe flight." The agent tensed beside him, his jaw tightening, his hands curling into fists at his sides, because he knew. He knew that meant this wasn't just over, it was an admission that it should have never happened in the first place. Snoop didn't move right away. He let the moment settle. Because sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is make people sit in the weight of their own mistakes. As Snoop finally reached for his bag, as he slid his wallet back into his pocket, as he adjusted his hoodie and took one last look at the agent who had tried to make a statement but failed, he knew this wasn't just something that would be forgotten. Because the people who had been watching, the people who had seen it unfold in real time, they wouldn't forget. They wouldn't forget how easily someone in power could try to create a problem where there wasn't one. Wouldn't forget how quickly an innocent man could be turned into a suspect just because someone in a uniform wanted to make it so. Wouldn't forget how Snoop Dogg never once raised his voice, never once lost his cool, never once played into the game they were setting up for him. And wouldn't forget how, in the end, he still walked away holding all the power. Snoop didn't stomp off, didn't rush, didn't slam his bag onto his shoulder or mutter under his breath. He moved slow, deliberate, controlled. Because real power isn't in who yells the loudest, it's in who walks away knowing they've already won. And today, Snoop Dogg had won. As Snoop disappeared into the crowd, heading toward his gate, the TSA agent finally exhaled, his shoulders slumping, the energy draining from his stance. Because no matter how many people he stopped after this, no matter how many routine screenings he claimed to do, he would never forget the day he tried to push the wrong man. Airports are places of movement, constant, endless, forward motion. People rushing to flights, employees going through their routines, announcements crackling over the speakers, security checks repeating in an endless loop. But now, in this moment, something had shifted, something unspoken had settled over the terminal like an invisible weight. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. But everyone who had been there, everyone who had witnessed what had just happened, felt it. Because Snoop Dogg wasn't just walking away from a security checkpoint. He was walking away from an attempted power play, from an abuse of authority that had failed spectacularly. And the people who had watched it unfold? They weren't going to forget. The TSA agent stood frozen, still gripping his hands at his sides, still staring at the spot where Snoop had stood just seconds before. His breathing had changed, not heavy, not fast, just uncertain. Because he had been so sure. So sure that his words, his uniform, his presence, his authority, that all of it was enough to control the moment. But it hadn't been. And now, he was left with nothing. Because in the end, what happens when you try to break a man who refuses to be shaken? You're the one who ends up looking weak. The TSA supervisor, standing just feet away, exhaled slowly, rubbing his temple as he watched Snoop disappear into the crowd, as the murmurs of passengers started to ripple through the terminal like the first wave of a storm rolling in. He had seen this before. He had seen what happens when security oversteps, when a situation spirals into something that wasn't supposed to be a problem, when one of his officers lets ego take the wheel instead of protocol. And now, he knew this wasn't going to stay inside this airport. This was going to spread. Because this wasn't just Snoop Dogg getting stopped. This was Snoop Dogg being watched by hundreds of travelers, in an era where cameras were always rolling, where the internet was always waiting, where moments like this could turn into something much bigger than a routine security check. And that was a problem. Passengers had already started moving again, already started shuffling forward in line, already started pretending that they weren't just watching one of the most recognizable figures in the world get singled out for no reason. But even as they picked up their bags and moved toward their gates, the weight of what had just happened didn't leave the air. Because they had seen it. They had seen a man stay calm in the face of a system designed to provoke. They had seen the way the TSA agent had searched, had asked questions, had pushed just a little too hard, and they had seen him come up with nothing. And most importantly, they had seen Snoop Dogg leave that checkpoint still in complete control. Snoop Dogg didn't rush, didn't stomp off, didn't throw one last remark over his shoulder. He didn't need to. Because when you know you've won, when you know you've taken control of a situation without even having to fight, you don't need to prove it to anyone. You just walk. And every step Snoop took, That was the real victory. The TSA agent, the one who had been so eager to pull Snoop aside, so sure of himself just minutes ago, he hadn't moved. Because how do you recover from something like this? How do you go back to stopping passengers after failing to shake a man who refused to be rattled? How do you go back to playing the role of authority when someone just exposed how little power you actually had? The answer was simple. You don't. And he knew, without a doubt, that this wasn't going to be just another day at work. Because once a man like Snoop Dogg makes you look powerless, you don't get that power back. Snoop had known it from the moment the energy of the airport shifted. He had felt it, the eyes, the phone subtly lifted, the movement of people who knew they were witnessing something bigger than just a security check. And now, it was only a matter of time before this moment belonged to the world. Because footage like this, it doesn't stay in one place. And once people saw it, once the internet got a hold of it, once the conversation started, TSA wasn't going to be able to brush this under the rug. Not today. Not ever. Snoop knew how places like this worked. Knew that, within an hour, the terminal would be back to normal. The TSA agents would go back to their routine. The passengers would move on, catch their flights, return to their distractions. But still, the energy had changed. People were going to leave this airport talking. Not about flight delays. Not about baggage claims. But about what they had just seen. Because this wasn't just about today. It was about every time someone had been pulled aside for random screening and knew it wasn't random. It was about every traveler who had been treated differently and had no way to push back. It was about every moment where power had been abused, but today, it failed. As Snoop approached his gate, ready to board, he glanced over his shoulder one last time. Not for long. Just long enough. Long enough for the agent to see. Long enough to remind him that, no matter how much authority he thought he had today, he had none. And as Snoop turned back and stepped onto his plane, he didn't need to say a word. Because he had already said everything. This wasn't just another celebrity moment. This wasn't just another viral airport incident. This was a reminder. A reminder that real power isn't in a badge. It isn't in a title. It isn't in who holds the clipboard or wears the uniform. Real power is in knowing who you are. And today, Snoop Dogg had reminded everyone exactly who he was. And the world? The world was about to talk about it. The terminal had returned to its usual routine, passengers rushing to their gates, flight announcements crackling over the speakers, suitcases rolling across polished floors. But for the people who had just witnessed what happened, the energy hadn't reset. The TSA officers went back to their posts, but their movements weren't the same. The supervisor had walked away, but his face had said everything. This was a moment that wouldn't be forgotten. And the TSA agent? He was still standing there, hands clenched at his sides, staring at nothing. Because how do you recover from a moment where the power you thought you had is taken away in front of everyone? By the time Snoop Dogg reached his gate, the moment wasn't just in the airport anymore, it was already spreading. Passengers had filmed it. Clips were already being uploaded. Whispers had turned into conversations, conversations had turned into text messages, and text messages had turned into tweets. And soon, this wasn't going to be just another day at TSA. This was going to be a conversation. A conversation about who gets stopped. Who gets questioned? Who gets treated differently? And Snoop had made sure the world saw it happen in real time. Snoop Dogg had spent his life earning respect. Not by demanding it. Not by forcing it. By walking in it. And today, he had walked through an airport security checkpoint the same way he had walked through life, calm, controlled, and completely unshaken. Because real power? It isn't in a uniform. It isn't in a badge. It's in knowing exactly who you are and refusing to let anyone take that away.